Many of my foreign viewers, those outside the UK, find it hard to come to terms with the notion that we here in the UK have to pay a TV licence. Here, any household watching or recording television transmissions at the same time they're being broadcast is required by law to hold a television licence. The law goes a bit further than this though. It applies regardless of transmission method, including terrestrial, satellite, cable, or for BBC iPlayer internet streaming. The television licence is the instrument used to raise revenue to fund the BBC and S4C. Is it enforced though? Well, yes it is, and many people have been taken to court both successfully and unsuccessfully and fined. There's a whole genre of online content on the topic and how to deal with the aptly nicknamed TV licence goons when they appear at your door, and today more and more people are cancelling their TV licence every day, in protest at the not-so-whiter-than-white BBC and this archaic and quite frankly ridiculous system. The big question many people still have and still debate over is, do TV vans exist? Did they ever exist? And if so, to what extent? Did they work? This is the complete history of the TV detector vans. But to start this story, we need to go further back than television by quite a number of decades. Radio broadcasting in this country had a slow and tortuous birth. Officialdom dithered and delayed. The higher the official circle, the less it was realised that broadcasting would soon sweep the country by storm and become a part of daily life. The example of America, where they had a 2-year start on us, should have been a sufficient enough clue. When, after prolonged negotiations, regular broadcasting was commenced, a form of licence was devised which made it a condition that the receiver to be used was one manufactured by a member of the British Broadcasting Company. As more or less every radio manufacturer was a member, this, apart from the royalty payable, seemed a pleasant enough arrangement, the idea being to exclude foreign-made receivers and components. High officials, with their usual narrow outlook, estimated in their wisdom that the number who would be able to make their own receivers would be very small, and they would be adequately covered by an experimental licence. This was to cost the same as a listener's licence, 10 shillings. Older viewers will remember just how simple those homemade sets were. A crystal and a tapped coil and you were good to go. In a couple of months it was found out that of the first 18,000 licences issued, a third of them were experimental, and the ratio threatened to grow to alarming proportions. So the issue of experimental licences was promptly suspended, and it was announced that they would only be granted in cases where the post office was reasonably satisfied that the applicant was an experimenter and actually making his own set, not simply hooking up ready-made components. This would be about January 1923, and the home constructor casually applied for an experimental licence and within a few days received a postcard acknowledgement. Things dragged on while the issue of a third form of licence for constructors at a cost of £1 was discussed. The constructor, as there was no licence to meet his case, was forced to remain a pirate. Needless to mention, all his pals, as they too became interested in this new hobby, took good care that they also became pirates. It was reliably estimated that within 3 months, the ranks of the pirates had swollen to 200,000, made up of an unknown proportion of bona fide constructors, plus the smart guys who simply evaded payment. Over 18 months elapsed while it was being decided, at high levels, whether the fee for a constructor's licence should be 15 shillings or £1. Eventually, a uniform licence at 10 shillings was started in July 1924. It was stated afterwards that nearly 250,000 pirates stepped up to take out licences within 10 days, and no charge was made for the past use of their receivers. They were genuine constructors. The smart guys came along more gradually. Perhaps they even held out until the mysterious detector vans descended on their districts. In October 1929, a vehicle known as the Terror, a post office detector van, was spotted in Glasgow, searching for oscillators and pirates. The equipment in the van included a screen grid 4-valve set with a frame aerial. In November the same year, after a stay of about a month in the Glasgow area, the post office reported that the van had been successful in discovering and warning about 15,000 wireless pirates. The van seemed to be an extremely effective form of propaganda. By March 1930, the green van had moved to Halifax in its relentless search for unlicensed homes. While it was prowling in the Newcastle district from April the 29th to June the 3rd, 1930, no less than 2,648 new licences were taken out, whereas during the corresponding period of 1929, only 450 were taken out. In November 1930, Mr. A.E. Bailey, the official in charge of the post office detector vans, said that Cardiff was sheltering more wireless pirates than any other area in the country. The street patrol with the van during a 2-week period allegedly yielded nearly £800 in increased licence revenue. In December 1931, the post office announced that a campaign against radio pirates in London, which lasted 4 weeks, netted £125,000 in licence fees. Some 250,000 new licences were taken out in those 4 weeks. Detector vans touring London the year later picked out pirates, and 350 prosecutions followed, while several hundreds more were being considered. It was also alleged that 146,000 new licences were taken out in areas that GPO detectives had not yet focused on. In April 1932, the Postmaster General stated in the Commons that the number of wireless licences taken out during 1931 was 4,329,170. The number of prosecutions was 1,042, and the fines imposed amounted to £1,933, with about £240 in costs. It appeared from the total number of licences in force from September 30th, 1931 to January 31st, 1932 that there had been an increase of about 544,000, many of which were regarded as directly or indirectly attributed to the campaign. In Germany, the listening tax in 1932 had to be paid monthly. Its collection from the set owners was made by the postman on his rounds. The annual broadcast licence was 24 marks. Germany at that time possessed roughly 4.25 million registered listeners, and radio pirates were discovered by the municipal chimney sweeps, who, in the course of their daily duties, visited all houses, flats and apartments. It was their duty to notify all wireless receivers to the local authority, allowing the latter to make the necessary investigations. By April 1932, the sinister shadow of the post office wireless detector van was helping to popularise the scheme of a Birmingham firm, which was offering free licences to purchasers of a special set. Apparently there were many who, while objecting to the payment of 10 shillings, didn't hesitate to spend considerably more on a good receiver when the licence was thrown in. There seemed to be a technological advance in 1932, when it was reported that the post office was using a special detector van capable of doing its business while travelling over 70 miles an hour, the idea being to detect the presence of an unlicensed set used in a car. At this time it was well known that if you kept a lodger in your house, he or she was required to take out a separate receiver licence if he or she used even a humble crystal set in his room. A story was reported in mid-1933 that a man who was a properly licensed listener received an unexpected and uninvited visitor in the form of his aunt. Just minutes after her arrival, there was a knock at the door, and a wireless inspector presented himself, demanding to see the wireless license and to inspect the gear of the man. These were produced, and he thought that the inspection was over when the post office inspector demanded to examine the secondary radio set in the house. The householder said that there wasn't one, and it would probably have meant application at the local police court for a search warrant had not the newly arrived visitor announced that she'd brought her small portable with her. It appeared that the post office van had been in the vicinity at the time with the special objective of searching out unlicensed lodgers' sets, and the man's aunt had been the first victim, despite the fact that her receiver was completely shielded by being in a tin trunk she carried her belongings in. In its new campaign against unlicensed television viewers in 1952, the General Post Office began employing vans fitted with apparatus that could detect any ordinary television set in operation within a radius of about 100 feet. The van carried 3 horizontal loop aerials on its roof. They were fitted, one at the front and 2 at the rear, at the 3 corners of an L shape. By means of a switch, a sensitive receiver could be connected to any one of the aerials, and the receiver output operated a meter and loudspeaker. A normal television receiver at this time, using electromagnetic deflection, necessarily produced a strong magnetic field, varying at the line and frame scanning frequencies. It was impossible to confine this entirely within the receiver, but it fell off quite rapidly as the distance from it increased. In the detection equipment, it was the line scanning field which was utilised, and the receiver was tuned to the second harmonic, 20.25 kilocycles. Older viewers may recall the effect that the line time bass whistle from a 405 line receiver had on a nearby AM radio tuned to the long wave band. These vans operated by detecting the magnetic field, rather than any radio signal, of the horizontal line scanning deflection within the cathode ray tube. Television tubes, unlike oscilloscopes, used magnetic deflection. The deflection current was a sawtooth with a frequency of 10.125 kHz. As this was the horizontal deflection, the magnetic field lines were almost vertical. The 3 small horizontal loop antennas on the roof of the van were used to detect it. As I said, these antennas were arranged in an L shape, manually switched in 2 pairs, either diagonally front to back and side to side. The coils and their receiver were tuned to a fixed frequency of 20.25 kHz, the second harmonic of the line scan signal, with a bandwidth of 200 Hz. The line scan frequency was generated within the TV as a multiple of the mains frequency and could vary slightly long term. This bandwidth was chosen to allow reception of a varying frequency, yet also to exclude as much ignition noise from the van's engine as possible. Most later radios and TVs used the same technique to receive signals. Incoming signals were mixed with an internally generated signal produced by a small circuit known as the local oscillator, or LO. These signals combined to produce a fixed intermediate frequency, or IF. The IF stages amplified the signals before they were passed on to the detector stage, where they were converted to audio. A further AF amplifier stage then boosted the low-level audio signals up to a suitable level to drive the loudspeaker. The circuit we're interested in is the LO stage. This has to operate at a frequency either above or below the received signal, the difference between the two being the IF. If you knew the receiver IF and whether the LO operated high or low of the received signal, then you could monitor the LO frequency to check and see if a television or radio receiver was in use. The distance the LO was detectable over was dependent on several factors, but with suitable equipment, a range of over 50 meters could be achieved. This is the principle that the TV detector vans operated on from the early 1960s. The job was made easier by the fact that most TV receivers used a standard IF at around 39 MHz, and I hope that all makes sense. I even confused myself when I was writing this. In operation, the receiver was normally connected to the front aerial, and the van cruised until a signal was heard. The van then slowed up, and the receiver was switched backwards and forwards between the front aerial and rear one immediately behind it. The aerial nearer the television set would give a stronger signal, and the signals from the two only reached equality when the bisector of the line joining the aerials passed through the television set. It's basically radio direction finding. When they were equal, the van was stopped. It was then known that the television set was in the house alongside the van. To determine on which side of the road the house was, the receiver was switched to the third aerial, and since this had to be either nearer to or further from the television set, it immediately revealed the side of the van on which the set was by an increase or decrease of signal. Reference to a list of license holders then showed whether or not the television set which had been detected was being used legitimately or by a pirate. The apparatus was claimed to be capable of locating the position of a television set when the van was within 100 feet of it. It appeared that in the 1950s, in addition to its primary objective of locating pirates, the van had an obvious secondary use in that in a rapid cruise around a given area, it would be possible to quite quickly determine how many television sets were in use at a given time. By comparing this figure with the known number of television sets obtained from the records of license holders, the percentage of viewers using their sets at a given time could be obtained. In February 1953, a GPO official stated that the function of the van was not so much to catch TV license dodgers, but to act as a gentle reminder to all local viewers when it arrived in each district. In July 1962, it was reported that illegal use of sound and radio television sets without a license resulted in around 13,000 successful prosecutions by the GPO in 1961. By 1966, statistics suggested that for every 4 TV set owners or renters who complied with the law, one other TV set user did not. This meant that 2 million licence dodgers were allegedly getting away with it to the tune of £10 million each year. Norman Collins, deputy chairman of Associated Television, called for the abolition of the BBC licence system. It is, he said, a ridiculous anachronism, a leftover from the days of headphones and cat's whiskers. Any tax on viewing is as ridiculous as the infamous window tax, which was abolished in 1851. The answer, he went on, was that all BBC services should be financed by the government granting aid. Anachronistic or not, most countries operating public corporation television still seem to prefer to raise revenue by the licence system. Moreover, total government finance of the BBC would in fact mean that everyone paid, indiscriminately. People who didn't view would be subsidising those that did. This would, in effect, still be the tax on viewing that Collins complained about. In the meantime, the GPO in their battle against dodgers seemed to rely on their 9 detector vans which were cruising the country as their main weapon. The vans apparently contained equipment valued at around £150,000, and the running costs plus the total of 27 crew added up to quite a lot of licence revenue. By 1969, the Postmaster General announced that the Post Office was increasing its already growing fleet of detector vans by 18 to a total of 38. The estimated annual loss of revenue to the BBC due to tax dodging by owners of television receivers was estimated to be £7.5 million. Vosper Electric announced in early 1970 that they had already started work on a repeat order for a further 18 television detector vans plus 2 sets of spares. The new detectors were developed by Vosper from a prototype operated by the Post Office for the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications. They were installed in standard 2500 series vans, specially adapted for the purpose by Vosper in order to carry the new equipment. Major modifications to the roof structure included roof plates, aerials, and aerial drive equipment. The electronic detection equipment was housed in a console behind the front seats and consisted of a receiver covering the frequency range of 470 to 860 MHz, which was fed from a pair of wideband aerials, the spacing between which was automatically adjusted as the receiver was tuned. This aerial system had a known directional characteristic and could be used to receive signals from either side of the vehicle, facilitating the scanning of buildings on both sides of the road. The receiver output was displayed on an oscilloscope. As the vehicle moved slowly past a chosen house, the oscilloscope display on a repeater screen was photographed by an instant developing Polaroid camera. Special sightline indicators at the windows of the van enabled the operator to pinpoint the boundaries of the property, and by pressing a button he could indicate these on a photograph. In this way, the operator was able to determine the approximate position in the house of the television receiver, and the channel in use could also be identified from the frequency to which the detector receiver was tuned. The frequency range covered by the detector allowed it to be tuned to the local oscillator of television sets operating in bands 4 or 5, and to harmonics of the local oscillator in television receivers operating in bands 1 or 3, and sound receivers in band 2. The widespread evasion of the payment of car radio licenses was also causing concern during this time too. The Postmaster General stated, quote, "My estimate shows that there are about 3 million sets in use and there are about 2 million evaders." He referred to the anomaly that a license fee didn't have to be paid for a battery-operated set used in a car, whereas a set installed in a car had to have a license. He said he was examining the position. One MP suggested that motorists with car radios should display a disc indicating that an up-to-date radio license had been obtained, but what good would that do? As the years went by, technology advanced, but the principles were basically the same. By the 1980s, direct local oscillator radiation from a television set was the source on which the detection was based. The range of detectors was 50 yards with a narrow polar response and 12 yards with a broader one. The range could be switched in order to determine the distance from the source. This was of value when, for example, investigating back-to-back terraced houses. The longer range could pick up a receiver in the house behind the one being investigated, so the shorter range was then used, despite the fact that its broader beam width made it less precise. The van operator selected oscillator frequencies manually, a digital readout showing the frequency to which the detector was tuned. Another circuit constantly scanned the spectrum. If it detected radiation, it would override the manual setting and display the result. This meant that unlicensed viewers couldn't escape detection by tuning to a fringe station not normally received in the locality, or by realigning their oscillator and IFs to a non-standard frequency. The display within the van consisted of an oscilloscope screen on which the radiation was shown as a narrow flat-top peak rising from a floor of noise. This could be stored for later display, along with marker blips to identify the precise location. During the 1980s and 1990s, a detection run started with a list from the licensing centre of all houses in a given area with no record of holding a current licence. Choosing a peak viewing time, the van then coasted down the street at about 10 miles per hour. The detector aerials on its roof were aligned sideways so that they scanned each house as it passed. The premises were also visually scanned. A key was pressed, putting a marker blip on the stored trace as each window, door and end of house boundary was passed. Therefore, trace examination after the van reached the end of the street would show the locations of all detected radiation. Should radiation be located at an address which didn't appear to be licensed, a call was made. Where there were separate flats, the detector aerials could be angled to scan the first floor, though not all vans were equipped to do this. High-rise flats couldn't be dealt with by means of radiation detection. If the records showed that more than 5% of the residents of a block didn't have current licenses, they were called upon, though there was no means of catching anyone red-handed in these circumstances. You'd think that portable low-range equipment operated outside the front door of each suspected flat would have been a viable possibility, but detection measures had to result in a net cash gain. The equipment plus the extra man-hours required for on-foot flat scans made this approach unprofitable. A block with less than 5% of unlicensed residents would be ignored. In the late 1980s, detector vans were supplied by Dodge and Leyland. In the 1990s, Ford Transits were introduced. In around 2002 to 2003, TV licensing launched its 10th model of detector vans. It was stated that these vans had removable branding so that they could operate covertly. On an interesting side note, video recorders had to be licensed too, unless the owner already had a current license for their TV receiver. The reason for this was that the most common use for VCRs was to record programs off-air for subsequent viewing. The position was less clear when a VCR was used solely with a video camera. If it didn't have a tuner, it couldn't radiate, so it couldn't be detected anyway. A VCR that was capable of playback didn't need a license, as it would be used only with pre-recorded tapes. In this case, the set used for display purposes had to be a monitor type without RF circuits, otherwise it would be licensable. For selective and infrequent viewers, this seemed to be a reasonable option. Quite a number of cassettes could be hired for the cost of the license. In 2013, the Radio Times obtained a leaked internal document from the BBC giving a breakdown of prosecutions for TV licence evasion. The 18-page document gave a breakdown of the number of people evading charge, as well as mentioning the number of people employed to catch those who didn't pay their TV licence. However, no mention was made of TV detector vans being used to catch such people, prompting media speculation over the truth of their existence. In response, a BBC spokeswoman rejected claims that the vans were a hoax. She said, "Detector vans are an important part of our enforcement of the licence fee. We don't go into detail about how many there are or how they work, as this information might be useful to people trying to evade the fee." A 2013 study was conducted on television emissions detection that found that emissions from modern television sets were still detectable, but that it was increasingly difficult to relate these to the received signal, and therefore to correlate a set's emissions with a particular licensed broadcast. The sets radiated from a number of sources, particularly the display controller and its low-voltage differential signalling link to the LCD panel. It was shown to be difficult to identify emissions from a set for a number of reasons. Firstly, emissions are much lower, owing to modern standards for EMI and the increasingly enforced compliance with EMC standards. Signals within the video processor IC would be an obvious target for recognition, in a similar manner to older detectors, but these are far too low to be measurable outside. Secondly, the available signals are now divorced from the broadcast signal. The LVDS link to the LCD panel provides receivable signals, but these are dependent on the configuration of the panel as much as on the broadcast being received, and are hard to reconstruct so as to be recognizable. In basic terms, A discernible video signal can be recognised, but this would be hard to tie in to a specific broadcast or to an evidentiary standard. A simple optical detector may be able to achieve just as much, and from a simpler circuit, and there is some suggestion that this method is now in use. But what evidence is there of vans being used today? News stories are often spread online and in newspapers which talk about detector vans coming to your area. In fact, just recently, viewers were warned that they could face fines of £1,520 if they were caught tuning into the Paris Olympic Games without a TV licence. There was talk of punishments of a maximum fine of up to £1,000, a victim surcharge of 40% of the fine, and £125 in court costs. Is the BBC really a victim in this? Somehow I think not. 500,000 households allegedly cancelled their TV licences in the past year, and the BBC claims to have a database of 31 million licensed and unlicensed addresses. This year it was reported that the modern-day detection equipment used to catch suspected licence fee evaders is struggling to keep up with technological changes. A detailed review into how the BBC runs these covert surveillance operations said that the success rate of such tactics was limited. The report pointed out that only a small number of deployments of TV detection teams actually resulted in a further enforcement action. Many people argue that TV detector vans never existed and were all just propaganda. I think we can pretty much debunk this myth. There's plenty of photographic evidence and eyewitness accounts to suggest that these did exist, and in decades gone by they were pretty successful. There's also strong evidence to suggest that the very thought or presence of a detector van was enough to con many people into buying a licence out of fear. Let me know in the comments if you have a TV licence. If you're not in the UK, then let me know your thoughts on this ridiculous concept.